The House chamber hummed with tension as Representative Jasmine Crockett approached the podium, her crimson blazer standing out against the somber chamber backdrop. The C-SPAN camera zoomed in on her composed expression as she prepared to address a controversial voting rights bill that had divided the chamber along party lines. Speaker Mike Johnson stood at his elevated position, his jaw visibly tight. Before Crockett could utter more than 3 sentences, he slammed down his gavel. "The gentleman is out of order and will be seated." The chamber fell into shocked silence as Crockett's microphone cut off with an audible click. "Mr. Speaker, I have been recognized for my allotted time," Crockett responded, her voice calm, but carrying across the suddenly silent chamber. Johnson's face hardened. "The gentlewoman from Texas is no longer recognized and will be seated immediately." What happened next sent shock waves through Congress and across America. When Crockett stood her ground, Johnson did the unthinkable. The gentlewoman from Texas is banned from speaking on the House floor for the remainder of this session. The gallery erupted in gasps. Democratic members jumped to their feet in protest. But what no one could have predicted was how members of Johnson's own party would respond to this unprecedented power grab. A response that would completely upend the balance of power in the House of Representatives within the next hour. Representative Jasmine Crockett was not someone who could be easily silenced, a former civil rights attorney with a reputation for fearlessness in the courtroom. The 42-year-old Texas Democrat had quickly established herself as a rising star since entering Congress. Known for her meticulous preparation and ability to dismantle opposing arguments with surgical precision, Crockett had become both a powerful advocate for voting rights and a thorn in the side of the Republican leadership. Speaker Mike Johnson, the 52-year-old Louisiana Republican, had ascended to the speakership following months of party turmoil. A constitutional lawyer with deep ties to conservative religious organizations, Johnson had campaigned for the speakership on promises to restore order to the House after the chaos that had preceded him. His supporters praised his firm leadership. His critics called it authoritarian and dismissive of minority voices. Today's session was meant to debate the Election Integrity Act, a Republican-backed bill that would impose new voter ID requirements and restrictions on early voting hours. Democrats had fiercely opposed the measure, arguing it would disproportionately impact minority communities. The stakes extended far beyond parliamentary procedure. In the gallery sat civil rights icon James Lawson, 95 years old, who had marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and risked his life for voting rights in the 1960s. Beside him sat Aisha Henderson, a 23-year-old student whose organization had registered over 50,000 first-time voters in underserved communities. For them, this wasn't abstract policy. It represented a continuation of struggles spanning generations. For Speaker Johnson, the political stakes were equally high. His razor-thin majority meant he could afford few defections, and moderate Republicans from diverse districts had privately expressed concerns about the bill's potential backlash. Johnson needed to maintain strict party discipline to push the legislation through, and Crockett's skilled dissection of the bill threatened to sway wavering members. "The American people sent us here to restore integrity to our electoral system, not to engage in inflammatory rhetoric that divides our nation," Johnson had stated at the session's opening, setting a tone that made clear he would tolerate little opposition. As Crockett stood at her microphone, refusing to yield despite having been ordered to sit down, the chamber crackled with tension. This wasn't merely a procedural disagreement. It represented a fundamental clash over whose voices deserve to be heard in American democracy and who gets to make that decision. "Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, there is no rule or precedent that allows the chair to ban a duly lead representative from speaking without a formal vote of the chamber," Crockett stated firmly, standing her ground at the podium. The chamber had gone from shocked silence to a rising murmur. Johnson's face flushed as he banged his gavel repeatedly. "The gentlewoman will be seated or she will be removed from the chamber by the sergeant at arms." Representative Hakey Jeff, the Democratic leader, immediately rose to his feet. "Point of parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker. Under what rule are you banning a member from speaking without a vote? The chair has the authority to maintain order in this chamber," Johnson responded tersely. The gentlewoman's remarks were out of the C-SPAN cameras, caught the confused expressions among the House parliamentarians who appeared to be frantically consulting their rulebooks. One leaned over to whisper to the chief parliamentarian, who shook his head slightly. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett called out, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. "I had spoken exactly 27 words. What specifically was out of order?" Johnson ignored her question, instead addressing the sergeant at arms. "If the gentlewoman does not take her seat immediately, she will be escorted from the chamber." The Democratic side of the chamber erupted in outrage, with several members calling out point of order and parliamentary inquiry simultaneously. The press gallery was a flurry of activity as reporters frantically typed on their phones and laptops. What happened next stunned the chamber. Representative Tom Cole, the Republican chairman of the Rules Committee and a respected institutionalist, rose to his feet. "Mr. Speaker, point of order. I believe we should consult the parliamentarian on this matter before taking such an extraordinary step." Johnson paused, clearly surprised by the intervention from his own party's senior member. "The chair has made its ruling," he responded, but his voice carried less certainty. The chief parliamentarian, caught on camera, appeared to be trying to get Johnson's attention, a concerned expression on his face. Johnson deliberately avoided looking in his direction. "Mr. Speaker," Representative Jim McGovern, the ranking Democrat on the Rules Committee, called out, "I move that the House suspend the rules to hold an immediate vote on whether Representative Crockett should be permitted to speak her allotted time." The motion, requiring a two-thirds majority, would normally be defeated along party lines, but the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted palpably. "Mr. Speaker," came another voice from the Republican side. It was Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, a moderate from Pennsylvania. "I second the motion. This body should decide this matter by vote." A ripple of shock passed through the chamber. Johnson looked stunned at the defection from his own ranks. The cameras caught other moderate Republicans exchanging glances and whispers. Johnson, visibly struggling to maintain control of the situation, recognized McGovern for his motion. As the clerk prepared for the vote, Crockett remained standing at the podium, her expression composed but resolute. In the gallery, the cameras captured James Lawson leaning forward intently, his aged hands gripping the railing. Next to him, Aisha Henderson was live streaming the proceedings on her phone, her expression a mixture of outrage and determination. "The House will vote on the motion to suspend the rules," Johnson announced, his voice tighter than before. As members began voting, something extraordinary started to unfold. Several moderate Republicans were voting breaking with their speaker. The press gallery erupted in a flurry of activity as reporters spotted the defections. When the voting concluded, the clerk announced the result. On this vote, the yeas are 290, the nays are 145, 2-3 having voted in the affirmative. The motion is adopted. The Democratic side erupted in applause. Johnson stood frozen at the podium, the gavel limp in his hand, as he realized that over 40 members of his own party had voted against him. "Mr. Speaker," Jeffer called out, "I move that Representative Crockett be permitted to speak for her full allotted time, and that her words be entered into the congressional record without restriction." Johnson, now facing a chamber that had effectively overruled him, had little choice. "The motion is agreed to," he stated flatly. "The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes." Crockett, who had remained standing calmly throughout the chaos, adjusted her microphone. The chamber fell silent as all eyes turned to her. What she said next would not only electrify Congress, but would spread across social media and news networks within minutes, fundamentally altering the debate on voting rights in America. "Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, who just voted to uphold the fundamental principle that in this chamber, as in our democracy, every voice deserves to be heard," Crockett began, her voice clear and measured. She paused, looking directly at Johnson. "What we just witnessed was an attempt to silence debate on a bill that would itself silence millions of American voices at the ballot box. The irony should not be lost on anyone in this chamber or watching at home. The chamber remained utterly silent, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Even those who opposed her politically couldn't help but recognize the significance of what had just transpired. "I have with me today," Crockett continued, holding up a thick binder, "the sworn testimonies of 372 American citizens who were wrongfully prevented from voting in the last election despite being legally registered. Not hypotheticals, not anecdotes, real Americans with names, addresses, and stories that deserve to be heard before we vote on legislation that would create even more barriers to the ballot box." She opened the binder and selected one page. Sarah Johnson, 68 years old, from Plano, Texas, a retired school teacher who has voted in every election since 1976, turned away because her driver's license had expired during the pandemic when DMV offices were closed. Under this bill, Mrs. Johnson and thousands like her would be permanently disfranchised. Crockett turned another page. Marcus Washington, 24 years old, a student at Texas Southern University, waited 7 hours to vote because his predominantly black neighborhood had just one polling location for 38 Zalhozen residents, while the predominantly white neighborhood next door had 6 locations for 27,000 residents. Under this bill, the already limited early voting hours that might have alleviated these lines would be further restricted. The power of these specific examples was evident on the faces of members on both sides of the aisle. What had been abstract policy was suddenly attached to real people with real stories. "My colleagues across the aisle speak often and eloquently about freedom," Crockett continued. "I agree that freedom is essential to who we are as Americans, but what freedom is more fundamental than the freedom to have a say in how you are governed? What liberty is more basic than the liberty to cast a ballot without unnecessary obstacles placed in your path?" She paused, turning to address the Republican side directly. "I know many of you believe deeply in this legislation. You believe it will secure our elections. I respect your conviction. But I ask you to consider whether security that comes at the cost of participation is really security at all. A democracy where fewer voices are heard becomes less democratic, less representative, and ultimately less American." The cameras caught several moderate Republicans shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Representative Fitzpatrick was seen nodding slightly as he listened. "The data is clear and unambiguous," Crockett continued, now holding up charts prepared by the nonpartisan Brennan Center for Justice. "Voter fraud is vanishingly rare, less than 0.04% in study after study. But the barriers this bill would erect would affect an estimated 21 million Americans who lack the specific forms of ID required, who work during the restricted hours proposed, or who live in communities where polling places would be consolidated." She turned back to face the full chamber. "I am not questioning anyone's intentions. I am questioning whether the problem this bill claims to solve is real, and whether the solution it offers would not create far greater problems for our democracy." The gallery was completely silent now, with James Lawson watching intently, occasionally nodding at Crockett's points. Aisha Henderson continued her live stream, her followers growing by the thousands as the confrontation went viral in real time. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett said, addressing Johnson directly, "earlier today, you attempted to prevent these facts and these stories from being heard. I do not believe it was because you fear me or my words. I believe it was because you fear the power of these truths to change minds, perhaps even within your own party." Johnson's face remained impassive, but the cameras caught him swallowing hard. "The attempt to silence debate on this floor today," she continued, her voice rising slightly with emotion, "mirrors exactly what this bill would do to millions of American voices at the ballot box. When we fear opposing viewpoints so much that we try to silence them rather than defeat them with better ideas and stronger arguments, we betray the very essence of the democracy we all swore an oath to protect." She turned to face her colleagues one final time. "I am grateful to every member who stood up today. Not for me, but for the principle that in this chamber, as at the ballot box, every voice deserves to be heard. That is the America worth fighting for. That is the democracy worth protecting." As Crockett concluded her remarks, the Democratic side erupted in applause, joined by scattered applause from moderate Republicans. The gallery, despite House rules against demonstrations, broke into sustained applause, with many rising to their feet. Johnson banged his gavel, calling for order, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. Crockett returned to her seat, receiving handshakes and embraces from colleagues as she walked. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation and Crockett's subsequent speech were spreading across social media platforms. The hashtags "Let Her Speak" and "House Revolts" were trending nationally, with Crockett's closing line about "every voice deserves to be heard" being shared millions of times in the first hour alone. What had begun as an attempt to silence one representative had instead amplified her message far beyond what a routine floor speech would have achieved. In trying to prevent debate, Johnson had inadvertently triggered the most significant and substantive discussion of voting rights the House had seen in years. By the time the House adjourned 4 hours later, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. "Let Her Speak" had become the top trending topic worldwide with over 2 million tweets. Major networks had interrupted regular programming to cover what analysts were calling an unprecedented revolt against a sitting speaker. CNN's special coverage featured a split screen showing the initial confrontation alongside Crockett's eventual speech. "What we witnessed today was extraordinary," said veteran political analyst David Gurgen. "Not just the attempt to silence a member without precedent or procedure, but the bipartisan backlash it provoked. This marks a potential turning point in how the House operates under Speaker Johnson's leadership." Outside the Capitol, reporters swarmed around Crockett as she walked with James Lawson and Aisha Henderson. "Today wasn't about me," she told them, Lawson nodding beside her. "It was about ensuring that every voice in Congress and at the ballot box has the right to be heard." What happened on the floor today is a microcosm of what happens when we try to silence voices instead of engaging with them. Lawson, speaking to reporters with the gravitas of his decades in the civil rights movement, said, "I've seen this struggle for 70 years. What Representative Crockett did today connects directly to what we fought for in the 1960 as the simple right to be heard, to participate, to have a voice in your own governance. The struggle continues, but today was a victory for democracy." Henderson, whose live stream had reached over 500 Zallos and viewers, told reporters, "My generation is often accused of not caring about politics, but what we really don't care for is politics that tries to exclude us." Today showed that when someone tries to silence voices, sometimes it just makes us louder. The impact rippled through both traditional and social media. Within hours, a compilation video juxtaposing Johnson's attempt to ban Crockett from speaking with historical footage of civil rights activists being silenced in the 1960s had been viewed over 15 million times. Memes comparing Johnson's expression before and after the vote went against him spread rapidly, with captions like "When silencing backfires and democracy won, authoritarianism zero." Political strategists recognized the moment's significance immediately. This is a rare instance where procedural heavy-handedness created a substantive backlash that transcended party lines, said Republican strategist Tara Sett on an evening news program. The visual of a black woman being told she couldn't speak, followed by members of both parties standing up for her right to be heard. That's the kind of moment that resonates far beyond Washington. Even some conservative commentators acknowledged the political misstep. On Fox News, former Congressman Trey Gowdy noted, "Whatever your position on the underlying bill, trying to prevent debate rather than winning it on the merits is never a good strategy." Speaker Johnson overplayed his hand, and it cost him both politically and in terms of his authority within the conference. By evening, the political fallout was materializing rapidly. Speaker Johnson's office released a statement attempting to justify his actions. Today's session was meant to focus on the substance of important election security measures, not inflammatory rhetoric. The speaker acted to maintain order and decorum in the chamber. The statement only fueled further criticism, with inflammatory rhetoric trending as users pointed out that Crockett had barely spoken 27 words before being cut off. The most significant development came late in the evening, when a group of 35 moderate House Republicans released a joint statement expressing grave concern about the attempt to silence debate. "While we may disagree on policy, the hallmark of our democratic system is open debate and the free exchange of ideas. Today's events did not reflect the values of this institution, and we are committed to ensuring all elected representatives can fulfill their duty to speak for their constituents." The unprecedented statement suggested Johnson's authority within his own party had been severely undermined. Congressional sources told Politico that a group of moderate Republicans had requested an emergency meeting with House leadership to discuss concerns about the direction and tone of leadership. Civil rights organizations mobilized immediately. The NAACP and ACLU announced plans to hold rallies in support of voting rights in multiple cities over the weekend. Representative Crockett's silencing and the House's response have galvanized a new wave of activism around voting rights, said NAACP President Derek Johnson. When people see attempts to silence voices, whether in Congress or at the ballot box, it reminds them why this fight matters. For James Lawson and Isha Henderson, the day's events represented both a continuation of historical struggles and hope for the future. Local news crews in Henderson's hometown captured students gathering to watch clips of the congressional confrontation, many expressing inspiration at seeing democratic principles defended in real time. What happened today connects directly to our history, Lawson told a group of reporters later that evening. I've seen attempts to silence voices throughout my life. What gives me hope is seeing people stand up against it, especially people from different political backgrounds. Recognizing that some principles transcend partisanship, social media continued to amplify the moment throughout the evening. A civics teacher in Atlanta posted about showing the clip to her high school students, writing, "Today, my students witnessed both the fragility and the resilience of democratic norms." One student said, "I didn't know Congress could still work like that with people putting rules above politics sometimes. This is the civics' lesson I couldn't have planned." The impact on the underlying legislation was profound. 3 Republican representatives who had previously supported the bill publicly announced they were reconsidering their positions and wanted more time to review the testimonials Crockett had presented. "I want to ensure we're addressing real problems without creating unnecessary barriers for legitimate voters," said Representative David Valadio of California, one of the members who had voted to allow Crockett to speak. Late that night, as the story continued to dominate news cycles, Crockett posted a simple message on her social media accounts. Today wasn't about winning or losing a political battle. It was about defending the principle that every voice matters. In the halls of Congress and at ballot boxes across America, when we silence debate, we weaken democracy. When we engage with those we disagree with, we strengthen it. The post was accompanied by a photo of her with Lawson and Henderson, 3 generations of voting rights advocates united in a common cause, a powerful visual reminder that beyond the parliamentary drama lay a fundamental struggle over whose voices deserve to be heard in American democracy. As morning news shows prepared their coverage for the next day, producers recognized that this was more than just another Washington confrontation. This was a moment when an attempt to silence debate had backfired so dramatically that it had changed the trajectory of a major piece of legislation and potentially altered the power dynamics within the House for the remainder of the session. Speaker Johnson faced a precarious position. His authority had been publicly challenged by members of his own party, and the visual of him attempting to silence Crockett would likely follow him throughout his speakership. Congressional historians noted that few speakers had ever suffered such a public rebuke from their own members, particularly so early in their tenure. For Representative Crockett, the moment marked a significant elevation of her national profile, with interview requests pouring in from major networks and publications. But those who knew her best recognized that her focus remained where it had always been, on the substance of voting rights and ensuring that every American had equal access to the ballot. The testimonials that Crockett had brought to the floor, which Johnson had tried to prevent from being entered into the record, were now being examined by journalists across the country, putting human faces and stories to the abstract debate over voting restrictions. Several major newspapers announced plans to run feature stories on Americans who had faced barriers to voting, directly inspired by the examples Crockett had highlighted. By the following morning, Speaker Johnson announced that the vote on the Election Integrity Act would be postponed to allow for further consideration and potential amendments. a rare concession that signaled the bill in its current form lacked the votes to pass. Several moderate Republicans had made clear they could not support the legislation without substantial changes addressing the concerns Crockett had raised. For James Lawson, watching these developments from his home in Tennessee, the day's events represented both continuity with the past and hope for the future. "I've seen America struggle with these questions of voice and power for nearly a century," he told a documentary crew filming him for a voting rights project. "What happened yesterday shows that the struggle continues, but also that when democratic principles are directly challenged, Americans can still come together to defend them." And in congressional offices throughout the Capitol, staffers were already reviewing House rules and precedents. Aware that the successful revolt against Johnson's attempt to silence debate had established a new understanding of the limits of the Speaker's power, the incident had created an unintended consequence, a bipartisan commitment to preserving the right of elected representatives to speak for their constituents, even when their words might be inconvenient to those in power. The power of Crockett's eventual speech lay not just in its content, but in the contrast it provided with the attempt to prevent it from being heard. In trying to silence debate about a bill that critics argued would silence voters, Johnson had inadvertently created the perfect metaphor for the larger struggle over Democratic participation, and in doing so had strengthened rather than weakened the opposition to his agenda. Call to action. This story highlights how attempts to silence voices often backfire, amplifying the very messages they seek to suppress. But defending democratic principles requires ongoing vigilance and action from all of us. If this story resonated with you, here are 3 things you can do right now. 1. Share this video with your network using Let Her Speak to keep the conversation going about the importance of open debate and voting rights. When more people understand the connection between silencing voices in Congress and silencing them at the ballot box, these attempts become harder to justify. 2. Check your voter registration status at vote.org action and help others in your community verify theirs. Many people don't discover problems with their registration until it's too late to fix them. Being proactive ensures your voice can be heard when it matters most. 3. Subscribe to our channel for ongoing coverage of voting rights issues and congressional oversight that mainstream media often overlooks. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our follow-up on how the Election Integrity Act evolves following this watershed moment. Remember, what happened in the House chamber that day matters, but what happens next matters even more. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep defending every American's right to be heard both in the halls of Congress and at ballot boxes nationwide. What was your reaction to seeing the House revolt against Speaker Johnson's attempt to silence Representative Crockett? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what other stories of democratic resilience you'd like us to cover next.